Of course, what I'm doing is also looking at the challenge that we see post-COVID crisis and how the situation is changing, or actually not changing, because the main point that I would like to make is that we are still in a phase in which, after the emergency of the COVID, still the structural issues behind the economies are an important element to tackle. I start with the next slide, so slide number 3. Where do we stand now? We have seen a massive economic shock. The lockdown has been strong across all geographies and sectors. And what we have seen is a demand and supply shock, trade collapse, and questioning of the global value chain. We now see a rebooting that is coming with a very strong heterogeneity across sector, countries, regions, and firms. And what we see is also the emergence of a very strong uncertainty that has various connotations and that really characterize the economic dynamic. We see 3 levels of uncertainty. One is related to the medical component. We don't know when immunization will come. We don't know the timing of a vaccine, and also if there will be a second round of contagion following this first round. And also the shape of the recovery. We have seen very strong policy answers, but we don't know whether there will be a second round effect from the crisis popping up. And then the long-term structural change that may be kicking out following this COVID crisis, like a structural shift in the economy, preferences, rule of the state, labor market conditions. So these 3 forms of uncertainty are quite important to look at. If we go to the next slide, I just show very briefly the economic data. What we see is the very strong correction in terms of GDP growth. Everybody is now forecasting a crisis that is stronger than the global financial crisis, and that may be the strongest crisis that we have seen in the centuries. At the German level, what I see is that actually we had, if we look at value added, we had already a correction in industry, excluding construction, where the other sectors have then shifted very rapidly in the first quarter toward of 2020 in negative territory. If we look at economic sentiment, what we see is that definitely March and April were a very strong correction. May is a little bit more on the positive side, and it starts showing some mild correction, but still on accumulated basis, we see the very strong slash on economic activities. If we look at the next slide, the point is here is mostly to discuss about a possible stabilization sign. On the one side, we have seen the flattening of the contagion phase in most countries in Europe, but the challenge remains related to, first of all, the fact that some of the large emerging markets, Brazil at first, and is still very much picking up in terms of contagion. So there may be a shift with some of the countries first affected with a stabilization phase, but others picking up. And also, if we look at moving out of the lockdown, there we see that if just at the end of April, beginning of May, GDP countries that were accounting for 80% of world GDP were in some form of lockdown. Now we see gradually the lockdown being unleashed. But again, we still have the strong uncertainty whether second round effect of contagion and second round effect of the crisis will kick in. If we look at the next slide, part of the concern is related to what we can expect in terms of shape of the recovery. We have been quite early starting to point out to to the likelihood of a U-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery. The reason why we were looking at this U-shaped recovery was that we were perceiving all this form of uncertainty to weight on the economy, and also second round effect of the crisis to potentially kick in. And we have seen this as the baseline. I hear some voices. Is it okay? So we were quite early focusing on this U-shaped recovery, taking into account the effect of the various forms of uncertainty and then the possibility of a second round effect kicking in both on the medical side, but also in terms of a second round effect of the crisis with impact on the corporate sector in particular. And this uncertainty, if we go to the next slide, is actually quite, we have been working a lot in the past, looking at the rule of uncertainty on investment activities in particular. Here what I'm showing is the rule of uncertainty picking up, and policy uncertainty in this case with investment in equipment and the very strong correction that you see. But in reality, also what we were looking at in the past was very much how much uncertainty is depressing investment as a firm postpone and rescale investment plan. And this factor of uncertainty is very, very much related to cash flows on the one side, but also to uncertainty, but is also very much related to the kind of firms that are impacted. If we go to the next slide, here I present something where we have been working in trying to understand the effect on the crisis on the corporate sector. And what we have been doing is look at balance sheet and profit and loss of the corporate sector, starting from the Orbis database that is quite a comprehensive database of firms at the European level. And what we are doing is an exercise in which we have trying to impact the effect of the lockdown on firms' revenues, firm cost, having in mind that even if the lockdown is hampering, is blocking activities for firms, some of the costs may be sticky, cannot be adjusted very much in the short term. And we also model the policy response. We have seen a lot of policy response coming from EU member states, where grace periods in terms of payments or rebates in terms of payments of the corporate for firms have been put in place exactly to allow reducing these fixed costs in the short term. And also we have seen the rule of guarantee schemes that have been put in place to allow firms to continue to access the credit market through the crisis. We model this, and then we also model the mid-term transition. So what's happening after the shock in terms of the crisis to the balance sheet and profit and loss of firms, but also we model it in the medium term, looking in a slower recovery phase. What are the strategic choices for firms? And what we find out is basically that in the short term, what we see is that even considering policy support, at least 50% of European firms would enter into some form of liquidity shortfalls. And then if we let the normalization process take a little bit more time with two different scenarios of 3 to 6 months normalization process, we see that the firms may enter into a trade-off between the choice of trying to continue protect in some way their investment plans, but if they do it, they will have to access to much stronger credit and increase very much leverage, creating a problem in the long term, or protect their balance sheet, not having too much leverage, but in that case, strongly affecting their investment plan. So on the corporate side, what we see is that the lockdown is having a very strong impact in the short term in terms of liquidity shortfall for firms, and in the medium to long term may generate a concern in terms of a trade-off between leverage and protecting investment, something that is very challenging for the firms, but is also challenging on a policy perspective in terms of intervention. I will come back in a moment to that, and I will show more in detail what we are doing. In the next slide, it's a part of the exercise that we are showing. So we have a number of calibration in the exercise with a different form of shock, of policy support, and also of the normalization process. But the interesting element is looking in the first table after 3 months, we see that with our simulation, we get to at least 50% of firms for a total value added of 60% of the economy that may enter into liquidity shortfall. If we look at the next slide, and we think at a combination of 3 months of lockdown plus different scenarios of normalization of a business condition, 3 to 6 months. Again, also considering the policy support, what we see is a cumulative in the crisis period loss in terms of net revenues for the corporate sector. This may vary from 5 to 10% of firm assets that reweighted in terms of size of the firms may lead to a shortfall of 13 to 24% of GDP. That's quite a big number, but it's really related to the current financial position of the corporate sector. If we distinguish between firms, we see that the major challenge is for the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Those are the firms that have less capacity to withstand the crisis as we see it in terms of liquidity shortfall, but also in terms of subsequent recovery phase. And those firms may have a shortfall in terms of net revenues over assets, again, that can go up to almost 12% for the small firms. I get to the next slide, and in the next slide, the subsequent one, okay. When we have the shortfall, even if we take the scenario, the most benign scenario that results in a 13% of GDP shortfall in net revenues for the corporate sector, we simulate the different ways in which this can be compensated by the corporates. And that's where I come with the strategic choices. On the one side, the first way in which firms may try to come back to normality is readjusting their normal level of cash buffers. We have seen before the crisis, the corporate tended to have quite some cash buffers. And we think that the post-crisis, as they did during the financial crisis, they don't need to come back to so much cash buffers as they used to have. This may be one of the versions for rebalancing, but the other two versions of rebalancing are the one that I was mentioning before. So what we see is really a trade-off emerging, and I'm talking about the graph in the middle, a trade-off emerging between trying to protect investment and by protecting investment, really try to get as much credit as possible to finance part of the investment, or the alternative could be to slash investment activities more, but protect the balance sheet without getting too much leverage. These trade-off emerge, and what we see is using the normal behavior of firms that this may lead to some investment shrinking by 30 to 50%, which would be actually starting from, would be double what we have seen in the financial crisis, even if we see that even in the financial crisis, the reaction of investment to GDP was extremely strong. And now we are talking about a much stronger contraction in terms of GDP. So it's normal to assess a much stronger impact of corporate investment going on. But on a corporate point of view, what we are really concerned is on the short term, the possibility of a liquidity shortfall. On the medium term, the emergence of a trade-off between leverage and investment for the corporate sector, where none of the two, nor the strong contraction of investment, nor the strong growing leverage is something that we really want to have at the economic level. And this calls for some thinking in terms of the policy intervention, and I will come back to that, because the policy intervention so far has been very much looking at in a first phase, delaying a payment for companies. In a second phase, create guarantee schemes that allow companies to access the credit market, but that increases the leverage. And we think that there needs to be also a third level that is allowing some form of equity type of instrument to give the alternative to the firms to preserve investment without increasing too much the leverage side. I go to the next slides, and here what I wanted to mention is just that a part of the policy response at the European level is very much being related to allowing the banking sector to continue to play its role in terms of credit channel. We see that the banking sector entered the crisis in a stronger shape in terms of bank capitalization compared to the financial crisis. And a number of measures have been put in place in terms of flexible use of existing capital buffer, limiting pro-cyclical assumption in loan loss provisioning, dividend and share buyback freeze, LTRO, the TLTRO to guarantee long-term funding to bank, and also credit guarantee schemes that actually allow the bank to continue lending, being insured on the credit risk point of view. So all of this has been put in place to let the credit channel going through the crisis, but still risk remain, and we know it related to the bank sovereign nexus, and also credit risk that at a certain point may still come back. If we go to the next slide, this shows what's happening to corporate lending so far. And here what we have is the data till April in terms of lending growth. And this is the new landing at the European level. What we have seen is actually a reflection of what I was mentioning before. So the first reaction after the crisis has been for the corporate to try to get as much credit as possible to create some reserve of liquidity. And this has also been particularly interesting if we look at the April data in terms of the maturity of the loans. So a switch toward longer term maturities above 1 year in order to secure the funding and the liquidity going on. But if we look, and that's the second graph, for which purposes the credit was requested, very much it's for inventories and working capital, much less for investment activities. So it seems that what I was mentioning before in terms of the concern that we have on the development of the corporate sector, so that the current crisis is generating a liquidity shortfall and is generating a pressure and a trade-off between investment and leverage. That's already visible in the very short-term data, with the firms very much rushing for liquidity, but putting investment decision on hold. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to mention one important class of firms. This is related to the innovative firms. We had in our investment report a specific analysis on startup and scaling up firms, where one of the main elements that we were showing is, yes, of course, in Europe there are less startup and scale up, but it's also true that the size of the firms matter. And in Europe, what we see is that as we pass from early stage, launch early revenue and scale up firms, EU firms stay smaller than the US one. That means also that they are more vulnerable. Smaller firms remain more vulnerable in a scaling up phase. And that's something that put at risk the already weak positioning of Europe in terms of innovative firms. If we look also at the size of the funds, is the same thing. And if we look at the funding side, we see that as long as we move up in phases of, in stages of growth of funds, European funds remain much smaller, and being much more smaller in a period of crisis like the one that we are seeing means more vulnerable. So this analysis, that is a pre-crisis analysis, is very relevant today, because if Europe wants to protect the startup and scaling up ecosystem that was developing, that was very much developing before the crisis, it has to pay particularly attention, because the nature of the market is as such that makes the European firms on the one side and funds on the other more vulnerable. So particularly attention has to be put in place in this moment of the crisis. If we go to the next slide, these are some data that are actually taken from KfW surveys done at the end of April and May, focusing on the startup and entrepreneurs, done with a startup and entrepreneurs. And actually we see a mirroring of what I was mentioning before. So the concern on the startup and entrepreneurs side is quite strong in terms of their expectation for dropping revenues related to Corona, and their assessment on the climate, business climate, VC business climate, that is having a very strong correction. And we see, which is quite natural, that the less liquid firms are more likely to seek support programs, and the importance of support programs in this moment to defend what was a growing and a stabilizing market for startup and scale up is particularly relevant. If we go to the next slide, a few hints on the policy support. Actually going to slide 17, in this graph I'm trying to put together all instruments put together in terms of the policy response. The first part looks at the liquidity crisis. And here we see a strong intervention with member state measures, starting from the flexibility, and that was a European base, but that made possible all member state intervention, flexibility in the Growth and Stability Pact, and more flexible procedure for the state aid rules. This allowed a number of measures put in place, emergency spending for the health sector, delaying payment and taxes affecting, directing to individuals and companies, but also social insurance and guarantees and public loans and equity going for companies, and indirectly keeping the banking, the credit channel going on. At the European level, we have been the quantitative, even the intervention of the ECB on the one side, but also we have seen the rule of the ESM with the new emergency facility, the SURE program with the Commission being put in place, and then the guarantee facility put in, and the funding facility put in place by the EIB. And this is the first part to address the liquidity crisis, is emergency package put in place, but a big step is now related to the recovery and potential growth element that is coming with the new multi-annual financial framework and recovery plan now being presented. If we go to the next slide, a few of the elements, I think now they are all well understood in terms of measures. The elements that I wanted to put in to discuss more in detail is related to the EIB rule. The EIB was already front-loading activities at the first place, putting a package of some 28 billion euro front-loading of activities to deploy all the instruments that were already part of the portfolio of the EIB, and to try to accelerate the deployment. And that's particularly important because it's not that well known, but the EIB through the EIF is really the backbone of the venture capital market in Europe, and also of the venture debt market. So this kind of equity type of instrument that are particularly relevant in this moment of the crisis, and also of guarantee schemes. The AGF is the new proposal that is now is in the process of being launched. Up to 200 billion euro will come from a guarantee provided by EU member state to address liquidity and funding needs for companies. We will provide a capped and uncapped guarantee, support ABS, risk sharing, as well as the venture capital and venture debt, and mostly will address SME. There are some nuances in the term of in the target group, but mostly will address SME. If we go to the next slide, the next generation EU package, that is the new proposal that is coming from the Commission with the MFF and the recovery plan. With the new way of financing that is also associated to issuing of European debt that is backed by the European budget. It's also proposing European EIB involvements in various elements related to the Just Transition Fund, to the InvestEU, as it was already agreed, the strategic investment funds, the solvency support instrument, and more activities out of Europe. It's a comprehensive package that has many different elements and with many of the details still to be elaborated, but that is trying to complement the support that has come to address the crisis very much on the short term with liquidity measure, and complement it with more stable mechanism to remain for the second phase of the crisis, and in fact very much targeting also equity type of instrument other than and the long-term challenge related to innovation, to climate transition, to other form of structural challenge of the economy. If we go to slide 21, I will try to go the main point, the importance, this is a more conceptual slide, but the importance of the recovery plan and the new MFF is really to discuss what's the objective of the policy response for Europe. And there, the point is that we are seeing a very strong crisis. And the question is where Europe wants to go after the crisis. And the response has to be strong enough to bring back Europe in a catching up phase. So not only reverting, resetting the clock and going back to the pre-crisis trends, but to address the structural issues that were there also before the crisis and that needs to be addressed. If we go to the slide number 23, that's where we were coming from, and actually our last year investment report that we published at the end of November is actually pointing to many of these elements. Europe is lagging behind in terms of digital adoption. We have a strong gap of European firms versus US firms pre-crisis, 58% of firms that are adopting digitalization versus 69 in the US. We saw the venture capital market much less development. We saw Europe missing in the group of top world innovators, where only 30% of the new top innovators, if we look at the firms that enter into the group of the global innovators, only 13% come from Europe versus 34% in the US. So the capacity of creating a new global leader in new emerging sector is something where Europe has been lagging behind. And also, we structurally Europe had to address issues in terms of competitiveness and productivity, but also the environmental sustainability and social sustainability were clear challenge. And actually the crisis may have created more needs to continue to look at both environmental sustainability and social sustainability as an effect of the crisis. Now I enter into some data related specifically to Germany. If we go to slide 24 and looking at more structural issues, for sure Germany remains at the European level a strong innovator country. Also the European Innovator Scoreboard as Germany as one of the good performers in Europe. But here looking at our survey of European firms, we have a number of questions asking the innovation capacity of firms, and we can distinguish between size small and medium enterprises and large firms. What we see is that when we distinguish between small and large firms, Germany is compared to is still performing well in terms of innovation, particularly for the large firms. A little bit less in terms of the small and medium enterprises. Even in the adoption capacity, we have seen some lower performance over time. And the reasoning that we have, and going to the next slide, is related to our studies, again, focus on our survey when we look at digitalization. And here the point is that innovation is more and more related to digitalization. And again, in terms of digitalization, Germany is comparable to the average of Europe in terms of digitalization of firms, much below the US, like Europe is. But there is a very strong gap between large and small firms, with larger firms much more capable to approach the digitalization process. And then if we look at the impediments, what firms consider an impediment to digitalization, the fully digital firms tend to have to complain both for lack of skill and digital infrastructure. They are the one facing more the digital infrastructure challenge, while the partially digital face very much a lack of skill staff, which is actually one of the elements, is the most important element for all firms for starting the digitalization journey. And so if I have to summarize, Germany, of course, Germany fares well in terms of innovation in a European perspective, but with innovation being more and more tied to digitalization, the small and medium enterprises that are lagging behind in terms of digitalization, they encounter more difficulties on the innovation journey. I go to slide 26, and that's showing some data that we have in terms of investment in energy efficiency. The other structural challenge that we see, moving into more investment in energy efficiency, is one of the key elements actually for the climate transition at the European level. What we see is that in Germany, like in Europe, we have a very strong investment in energy efficiency for firms that are in energy intensive sector, less in non-energy intensive sector. And something that I'm not showing in the graph, but that I find quite relevant, is that when we look at which firms are investing in energy efficiency, much more it's associated to large firms, and much more associated to large firms. But what is interesting is also that to invest in energy efficiency, there are two elements that are have a strong predictive power on the decision of the firm to invest. On the one side, having done an energy audit that gives visibility to the firms of the advantage of going for energy efficiency incentive. The second one is the quality of management and advanced management practice that shows that, again, it's difficult to understand what are the benefits of energy efficiency, and more advanced managerial practice are always associated also with more propensity to invest in energy efficiency. Almost at the end, I go to the next slide. That's slide 27. This is again coming from KfW surveys at the municipality level, showing also the impact of COVID, and which shows a very strong local public investment need to support recovery and structural transformation. And I get to the last point in terms of the conclusions. So my slide 29. And my key message is that we are living a very strong crisis. The uncertainty stays extremely high, as I was saying, related to various factors. And that is going to have a very strong impact also in the next months on the recovery phase. And there are challenges that need to be faced. The policy response has been very strong so far, but the important point is to keep the strong pace of the policy response, but also look at the incentive in order to make sure that the strong policy response also tackles the structural issues of the economies that are long-lasting structural challenge for the economy. This is true at the European level and at the German level. And if we look at Germany in particular, the issue of the innovation capacity and the investment in energy efficiency, the climate transition, are all aspects that are quite important and where the policy response needed to look at the post-crisis environment to try to create the incentive for moving faster in this structural transformation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah, for this a comprehensive overview of the formidable challenges that we are facing in Europe concerning investment. So because the beginning was so difficult due to our technical challenges, I did forget to tell everybody a little bit about housekeeping. So of course you are welcome to ask questions. Some people have started to do that in the chat. After Jakob has done his comment, we will have a little bit of time to discuss these questions. There's a certain possibility when you click on participants in your panel at the bottom of your screen, you can also raise your virtual hand. So, but after having explained this, I would like to let Jakob comment a little bit for us. Of course, we've heard there was a investment shortfall in many ways, even before the crisis, to be able to make the digital transition, the sustainable energy transition. There was there's a weak development of capital markets compared to the United States, and now we're in this major economic crisis. Will we be able to implement the investment that we need? Jakob, you have the word.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you, Deborah, for your wonderful presentation. It's a pleasure listening to it. And there's, I mean, I won't try and sort of reiterate the many excellent points that you've made. I was particularly struck by the way in which you looked at companies' balance sheets and the question, what does one do after, to some extent, the liquidity bazooka has run its course, and it becomes difficult for companies to rely only on credit. And in some areas, they may require equity in order to continue functioning in a reasonable manner. And that's, of course, a very challenging situation for governments, because providing liquidity is one thing, but making sure that if one injects equity, one gets a fair deal, not only for the company in question, but also for the taxpayer, is all that much more challenging. Because, of course, in principle, in market economy, those people willing to inject fresh equity, they should have priority over legacy debt holders and legacy bondholders, because, of course, the objective of the government is not to subsidize wealthy multimillionaires who own those companies, but the objective is to help the company to continue running, because it hopefully has a sound business model. By the way, that's true in Germany and that's true elsewhere. One of the prerequisites for getting any kind of support is, of course, to be able to demonstrate that before the crisis had hit, one had a viable business model, which is, I think, a decent indicator of the quality of the company. So that's a part of the presentation which I particularly liked. But let me come back to the big picture, and let me give you a little bit of a sense of what we did recently in Germany. Of course, Deborah is absolutely right. The primary shock of this crisis is a colossal and very, very steep supply shock, shutting down large parts of the economy in order to slow and reverse the spreading of the virus. And that's something one needs to tackle, and I think we did very early on, as did many other countries. And sometimes, of course, people think things in Germany worked out very well on account of brilliant people having far better foresight than in some other countries. Unfortunately, that's not true. Part of the story clearly is that Germany was lucky not to be among the first countries which were hit, and therefore we were able to learn from some of the experiences in other countries. And learn we did, but I think had we been hit the first, we would have very much struggled to find suitable responses. But so the first reaction on the financial economic front was the liquidity bazooka, was short-term work, was protecting, if you will, companies and employees against the supply shock. And then, of course, as a second round effect, but a very substantial one, you get a large-scale demand shock. We don't yet have the data to be able to really assess very well the dimension of this problem, the duration of that problem, but it's certainly there. And that's why, if you look at our stimulus package, there are important elements of demand stimulation in there as well. And there was a very interesting discussion how targeted this demand support should be towards particular sectors and towards particular activities. And there's a case to be made that, of course, demand is hit much more substantially in some areas than others. But there's also a case to be made that as part of the demand supporting policies, perhaps one shouldn't necessarily, for example, only support legacy production in areas that are not, for example, environmentally sustainable. And so there was a very interesting discussion that we had on that. And I'm delighted to say that we ended up with very much a forward-looking agenda, and that brings me to the third point, which was also very much present in Deborah's presentation, which is the transformative aspect, and investing to the tune of 50 billion in research and development, in energy transition, also easing energy transition, which has a demand aspect by reducing our levy on electricity, which we introduced in order to fund the introduction of renewables. So a number of transformative elements that make up a good third of the overall stimulus package that we have. Now you may say, well, but these transformative elements, don't they take a little bit too long? If the problem is there now, is the fourth T, so timely, targeted, temporary, and then transformative, is misplaced. And we are, of course, convinced that it is not, precisely because there are a number of things that we ought to be doing anyway, and we might as well get them on the way now, and also because the demand side of the problem is very much linked to various types of uncertainty, and Deborah alluded to that. The most important part of uncertainty is not the uncertainty about next week. It's the uncertainty about the next couple of years and where we're heading. And by charting the way in terms of a transformation in the area of energy transition, digitalization, and so forth, we can substantially reduce uncertainty about the future and therefore help restore confidence in the present. And so it's not at all a contradiction, even though sometimes it's made to be one, but we strongly believe that these things go together extremely well, and having, if you will, a brighter future very much brightens the mood for the present. And so we were lucky in that it was possible to present an overall stimulus package with a strong supply side element, with a strong demand side element. And it was striking for me to see that the old, if you will, intellectual infights in our economic profession between those emphasizing the demand side and those emphasizing the supply side weren't so much present. So it's really, I think the crisis brought us together. And similarly, the old cleavages between people saying, well, it's all about the economy, and others saying it's all about sustainability in the ecology, that also was something that was a bit of a thing of the past, and we were able to overcome those differences. Because really, I mean, this is partly about Germany, but partly Deborah's presentation, for good reason, was about Europe. Let me add that by engaging in such large-scale economic support measures, it is not at all the case that our European partners and friends need to worry. To the contrary, there are large-scale positive spillovers by some of the larger economies in Europe, including Germany, doing their part in order to overcome the crisis. Other countries will benefit as a result. And that's true for the demand side measures, but that's also true for the supply side measures, because of course, if you look at companies, and I'm delighted that the EIB will be invited to do more on the supply side, supporting companies. If you look at supply side measures, the reality of mid-scale and large companies in Europe today is a European one. So most of these companies, they have a footprint, typically a global footprint, but very much a European footprint. And I'm very happy that we don't have a discussion, be it in Germany, be it in France, be it in Italy, where some people are going out and say, well, you must only support a company if, I don't know, 60% of the jobs are in that particular country. That would be madness. And I'm delighted to say that we don't see it anywhere in Europe, and we certainly don't see it in Germany. So these support measures, even though they happen at the national level, they're very much European in spirit, and should be regarded as such. And I would say to a very large extent, the more the merrier, the more others are doing. That's certainly true for Germany, where such a large open economy. The more others are doing, the more we will benefit. The more we are doing, the more the others will benefit. But what is true is that just everybody doing national programs won't be enough. And that's, of course, what inspired the Franco-German initiative, the Franco-German proposal for a 500 billion euro recovery fund, which I think to an important extent is now also reflected in the Commission's proposal, and previous measures, including providing much easier access in a COVID-19 window of the ESM, having what I was delighted to see that this was possible for the first time, something akin to a European unemployment insurance, strengthening EIB. So a number of very good measures, I think, have been developed in that crisis, to the extent that my minister even likes to think of the present situation with all its difficulties, with all its drama, with all the human suffering, as a Hamiltonian moment, in the sense that maybe in this crisis, Europe can come together and not only find adequate responses to the situation we're in right now, but also start to develop a solid, robust European fiscal architecture fit for currency union, and making certain that, that's quite important, you can see sort of, I'm very German on this after all, solidarity and responsibility do go together. So I was delighted, Deborah, to listen to your presentation, and I'm now much looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jakob, for these insights from the German policy package and also the thinking behind the European policy package. Perhaps before I go to the questions that came from the audience, they're not many, by the way, so don't be shy. But perhaps I can give the word back to Deborah, and you can say, so you heard Jakob's explanations, how the German package contains all the important elements, so liquidity support, demand support, but also investment to stabilize expectations. And he explained how this can also help neighbors, given the strong trade ties, etc. What do you think is crucial now that the European package is still being supported? What needs to be in there so that the same positive effects that the Germans are expecting for their package then can also become effective at the European level?
Okay, so thank you very much, and I think I very much like the point made, and I just wanted to mention a couple of things just to reinforce, because I fully subscribe to everything. One side, we had a lot of thinking when also on a policy point of view, when we saw all intervention at the national level coming up with guarantee schemes to support the corporates. Part of the question was, do we need, on top of all the measures put in place by the single member states, do we need another mechanism that provides this European guarantee facility, that provides support to corporate at the European level when we have so much going on at the national level? And our answer was quite immediately to come up with a clear understanding that this was needed. And the reason why it was needed was, first of all, because the support package of member states were not designed in the same way country by country. And also the intensity was different, but also having something that is European based and targeting the corporate sector supports the single markets. It's something that supports competition. It's allowing similar conditions all over Europe for corporates. But also another element that is interesting is we were looking at our ongoing economic activities, and we used to do every year through we work together with JRC, that is the research component inside the European Commission. We work with a model that is called Romulo to assess the macroeconomic impact in the short and in the long term in terms of GDP and employment of our own lending activities as EIB and the investment that we support. And what we find out is that looking at the past activities that we have, when we look at the macroeconomic impact of these activities in the long term in specific countries, 40% of the macroeconomic impact that of the benefit, macroeconomic long-term benefit of our own activities in a single country, they come from a spillover effect of investment that take place in other countries that we have supported. So what we find out that looking at the past data of our own activities, the spillovers of activities taking place in another countries are quite significant. That means that for all European countries, there is an advantage to have a European package and not only targeted packages going country by country. It's really the value of the single market that is seen on that point of view. The other point that I very much share is I'm very much saying that there is this, if you want an optimal sequencing in terms of support measure for the corporate sector, immediately you have to provide the liquidity. In the middle, you have to provide access to the credit market, but then you may enter into an issue with leverage, and then you need a different form of equity type of instruments. That was the analysis that I was putting before. I very much am concerned when we talk about the public sector and equity type of instruments, because you wanted to prevent issues in terms of moral hazard to happen. So the way in which these equity type of instruments are designed and are implemented is extremely difficult because you have to prevent moral hazard to kick in. I don't have the exact answer for the moment. What I see is that in our EIB activities, we have been working with instruments related to venture debt on the one side, and with funds on funds for venture capital, and we think that somehow particularly on the funds on funds for venture capital, the intermediated nature of activities prevents some of the moral hazard issues. Of course, when you talk about large corporate, public sector equity, the situation is more tricky. And I think there the balancing of how you deal with the moral hazard is something quite important to look at. I also very much welcome the notion of this transformative, the fourth T in the package. I think this is extremely important, and I'm thinking at the work that we were doing in the research department of the EIB in the last year, post-financial crisis. The problem was when we saw the recovery kicking in, the recovery strengthening, we were for a number of years always coming back to the point that Europe had an issue in terms of long-term growth, in terms of productivity, in terms of innovation capacity, in terms of the structural issue of the economy. And I think we have to take the opportunity of the crisis. Of course, in the immediate, the optimal response is liquidity, but if you manage after the liquidity part, in the recovery part, to engineer the transformative element, this is what we really need in Europe in this moment. We need to relook at the structural part of the European economy and make sure that in terms of innovation capacity, even a diffusion of, it's not really innovation, but digitalization, I think is something quite important we have to tackle. The issue in terms of labor skills and digital skills, maybe the crisis has play a positive role in terms of digital skills. And it's easier to do things like what we are doing today. But I think that the fourth T the transformative part is extremely important, and it has to be part of the policy response.
Excellent, thanks, Deborah. And then I mean, you're really advanced already in the time, but there are a few questions from the floor that I do want to pose to you and to Jakob. First, there's one. So we heard in some ways that how good the recovery, so the support packages are, but there's one question from Reinhold Rickes who is asking, so we reduced the value added tax. I suppose that's for you, Jakob. And couldn't already price developments are weak? Could this reinforce these price developments, so deflation, I suppose? And what does that mean then for the recovery? Jakob, do you want to take that?
Yes,
question?
no, by all means. So let me first say that clearly a reduction in VAT is, while pass-through won't be perfect, will sort of on average, of course, reduce prices. That's clear. But more importantly, of course, a credible time-bound reduction in VAT will increase taxation and therefore also prices at the end of that particular episode. And in this case, credibly, because as you know, it's a relatively expensive measure, at the end of 2020. So the measure will take place from the 1st of July 2020 to the 31st of December 2020, and then in a credible manner, prices are going to go up again. And that's of course why this sort of measure is not something that is entirely new conceptually, but is in fact often proposed for situations at the zero lower bound of monetary policy, where one tries to create some sort of inflation expectation so that people don't attend for prices to fall further, but instead say, well, now maybe is a good time to buy a certain number of things. So from the perspective of inflation and inflation expectations, there's no need to worry at all about this, if you fall in prices, if you will, because the trick is really increasing the tax afterwards. And that's what make all the difference. Now, you may say, and let me be very precise, how about the couple of weeks now? We're now in the middle of June, and there may be some people who say, well, let's wait a little bit for the larger purchase until the 1st of July. And there I would say, fair enough. There is a very short period of time, but we do it as quickly as we can, and some people in the sector are criticizing us and saying, well, we don't have enough time to make all the necessary IT changes and the relabeling of prices. But the point is, there is a short period of time between announcing it and implementing it where there can be a little bit of a problem, but it's so short. We announced it this month. It will happen on the 1st of next month, that I think for practical purposes, the impact of that won't be very, very big. But let me, because the question was asked, even though that wasn't the main thrust of the question, also point to the fact that yes, indeed, it's not a super targeted measures, and one could have imagined much more targeted measures. But one of the problems with these much more targeted measures is they're really, really hard to implement in practice. It's all very well to talk about, I don't know, a voucher scheme for sector XYZ, but try to actually do it. And that's one of the reasons why many countries first looked at certain types of voucher schemes and then decided, well, actually doing it is pretty hard. And let me point to a second, I think, fairly good characteristic of the VAT reduction, which is not targeted, which is, of course, a part of the downside. But within that general VAT reduction, the upside is that we know from economic theory that the pass-through of a tax reduction depends to a large extent on elasticities of supply and demand, of course. For sectors where the crisis had really hit, the supply elasticity is going to be big because of overcapacity. And so the pass-through is going to be pretty good. And that's a good thing. So in a sense, automatically, prices will react the most to the VAT reduction. They will react the most anyway, because there's overcapacity. And on top of it, there will be a VAT reduction in those sectors where there's overcapacity, because the sector has been hit hard because there was a specific, typically demand shock. And then, of course, there are those sectors which are supply constrained. Those sectors where there's still an element of lockdown. In those sectors, the elasticity of supply will be rather inelastic. That's the nature of being supply constrained. What does it mean? It means that in those sectors, again, by magic, more or less automatically, the price pass-through is going to be much less. In the extreme of completely inelastic supply, it's going to be zero. So in other words, we have a situation where those sectors that are still supply constrained, they will benefit by and large from somewhat enhanced profitability. And those sectors that are demand constrained, they will pass through the price, therefore leading, hopefully, depending again on demand elasticity, to some degree of quantity expansion, which is what you want. So this self-adjusting aspect of VAT does make it, with the caveat, it's not a targeted instrument, but targeted instruments are much harder to implement, has relatively good characteristics. And it will be fascinating, of course, to see afterwards, because the empirical evidence on precisely this kind of measure it leaves something to be desired. It will be absolutely fascinating to look at empirical studies afterwards to see what the real impact was. But I think we have some heuristics telling us what we would expect. And let me add one final little point. There's a lot of discussion about menu costs right now, how much it costs, if you will, to change the price tag for those among you who are not economists. And one of the good things is, in a crisis like that, it's very likely that many prices will be changed anyway. So in other words, the additional cost of changing them a little bit more is rather smaller than would be the case in normal times.
Okay, thanks for this explanation. So we'll take one last question, which was about, it's not, give it to Deborah. It's not strictly speaking your remit, I think, at the EIB, but since we were talking about transformative and how important that is, and of course it was more about competitiveness, productivity, etc. But there was also somebody from the audience who was worried about social sustainability and pointing out that in the financial framework, medium-term financial framework, the European Social Fund is smaller than it was in the previous framework. And I'm assuming, since we saw that this crisis laid bare a lot of social problems as well, is that something you look at the EIB? Do you worry about this?
Yes, I think we very much worry, because actually when you look at the even before the crisis, in the last years, what we have seen is was a very strong challenge in terms of social sustainability at the European level, that was going both in terms of intergenerational sustainability, then was going also in terms of spatial sustainability, with very strong divergence popping in. And what we had seen also was that the past crisis had in many countries led to a rebalancing of expenditure from current capital expenditure to current expenditure, and that was particularly pronounced in the regions where where investment needs were stronger. So in reality, there was a very strong, even before the crisis, there was a very strong effect in terms of inequality, if you want, at various levels that was emerging at the European level. And now what we see in terms of the crisis, we see, of course, data are not really so much available, but some of the first analysis point to a challenging situation. I make a small example. We were looking at these new fancy Google data that are high frequency data. And we were looking at that there is a much more concern of people in terms of job security, particularly in regions where that for other characteristics you already see that are more less advanced economically regions. So you see that, and also that people that the nature of the crisis is impacting more the lower skilled part of the population. So the issue in terms of inequality is likely to be strengthened both in terms of inequality of the population, but also in terms of regional inequality. So you really need to have a strong intervention going on that point of view. And I think that the usage of the means should be really well targeted and make sure that it's really effective in having an impact. But we are very concerned about that.
Okay, thanks. It's good to know, Deborah. So maybe we need a bigger European social fund. So yeah. Although we do really have to close, but we didn't have many questions. And the last question is an opportunity to talk again about something very beautiful, big, the Hamiltonian moment you referred to, Jakob. There was a question which was more detailed. So a person asking, Astrid Manroth, asking how the national recovery and resilience plans that are required under the recovery and resilience facility, how they can contribute to the objective of a robust EU fiscal architecture. I'm not sure whether that was what you were referring to, but perhaps you can give us a final word here about
Well, it is not exactly what I was referring to when I was talking about a solid and robust European level financial architecture, but I think there's a link. If you look at US fiscal federalism, what is quite popular are so-called tied grants, where the federal government provides member states, or in this case, states of the United States, with funds that must only be spent on a certain type of activity. For example, what's quite popular, because in the US, unemployment insurance is not a federal, but is a state-level activity in a crisis to provide a federal incentive for more generous unemployment insurance schemes. And that would be an example of such a tied grant. And I think who asked the question, by the way? I didn't catch the name.
Astrid Manroth.
Yeah, what she asked, and of course we are not in the spirit right now. It's a crisis of nobody's fault of imposing heavy conditionality. But nevertheless, of course, the idea is to tie measures that are now, where funds are made available at the European level, to actually tackling the causes and the consequences of what's going on, and together with, and we'll have to see how this exactly works in the recovery fund, with forward-looking projects where, if I may add, we have to be very careful that we don't end up organizing the recovery fund as a wish list, where sort of every policy field says, well, there's a large pot of money sitting there. Can't you do something, I don't know, for sports or for all kinds of activities, where in the end, the original objective of a crisis facility is lost. And the original objective is lost to make sure that we escape the logic of juste retour and enter for this particular vehicle a logic of needs-based solidarity. So to cut a long story short, I think those tied aspects of support and those requirements, they may be part of a more robust architecture, but what I really meant by a longer run sort of Hamiltonian agenda is on the side of borrowing and spending, on the side of revenues, including tax revenues, and very importantly, and that's where responsibility comes in, because, you know, if at the European level, you simply have a pool of money sitting there and everybody can have access at will, I don't need to tell any participating economist, we create a massive common pool problem. So what needs to be added to this is a sound governance structure at the federal level to make certain that solidarity and responsibility go hand in hand. And so all these three elements are important, and those are the elements that I had in mind. What we're trying right now is in a unique situation where this is not about moral hazard, and that makes it much easier to try out a certain number of things. We do what it takes in order to survive the current crisis, in order to demonstrate citizens throughout Europe, we are in this together, we are a community of fate when something terrible like that happens, where also we demonstrate to financial markets that we are a community of fate when something terrible like that happens and hits different countries differently. But what lies ahead of us is a construction of a well thought through, solid and robust fiscal architecture for the Union, which will then hopefully also put us in a much better position in order to tackle the challenges, the global challenges. And we live in a challenging global environment where I think we have good reason to do a certain number of things with enormous value added, including in the external dimension, together rather than separately and only in a loosely coordinated manner. So that's, I think, what my minister had in mind when he talked about the Hamiltonian moment, and I would certainly agree with that.
So thank you. I think that's a very nice last thought. Thank you very much, Deborah and Jakob, for a very inspiring discussion. Thank you also to the audience for being so patient with us, with our technical difficulties. So we said that digital skills are even more important perhaps than, or ever more important. And Deborah stressed that we have an opportunity now. So the pandemic is also a digital shock. The OECD today in DIW, we were not at our best, but what we did show is that we don't give up and that we work together to resolve problems. And I hope that next time things will be more smoothly. But I enjoyed this very much. So thank you very much to everybody, and have a nice afternoon.